So on the final exam, I'm going to continue this conversation on a new YouTube link, but on the final exam, it'll be largely reproductive and urinary. There will be some respiratory system, not about any physiology at all, only about anatomy. And that's exactly what you've already done in lab. So this week in lab, you've already looked at the lungs, you looked at the larynx, you looked at the sagittal section of the head. And that's what I will be asking you on the final exam. It'll be only about structures. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to move forward, and almost like what I did in class or in lab, I'll go over just a couple of ideas, and then I'll be focusing on the anatomy. And I may very likely get this done in the next 25 minutes, and this will be the only discussion we'll have on tape over the respiratory system. And then we'll have our test next Monday. That'll leave next Wednesday to discuss the kidneys and the urinary system. That'll leave the following Monday to talk about the reproductive systems. And then we would have the final exam on that Wednesday, the 30th of July. Okay, so we're moving toward the end, aren't we? Wow, right? Comes fast. So we've got the respiratory system. Got to start making sure I say respiratory now. And anatomically, we're going to divide this up into the upper and lower. Very simple. The upper respiratory tract is going to be all of the structures from the nasal cavity down through the pharynx. So the pharynx will be the end of the upper respiratory. And then the lower respiratory tract would start with the larynx, L. So the larynx starts to lower and goes down from there. Now, the other way we can break it up is functionally. Functionally, the respiratory system is broken up into the conducting zone and the respiring zone. And the conducting zone is simply as it suggests. It's the part where air is being conducted or is being sent down to the microscopic structures of the lung. So this is everything from the nose all the way down into the bronchioles. Then the respiratory portion, down where the actual gas exchange happens, that's way down at the very tippy ends of the bronchioles and going into the alveoli. So I think every slide I'm going to show you right now is one that's already also in your lab. But recall, I didn't go through that PowerPoint. I let you watch the video instead, and then I went back and I went through these images quickly to make sure everyone was on board with the structures. So I'm basically going to do the same thing right now. So you have the upper and lower respiratory tract. And the upper is everything down to the pharynx. The lower, the larynx, and down. Okay, so that's just the anatomical way, with the pharynx and the larynx being the dividing place. Now, what does the respiratory system do for us? I think we got this. We inspire and we expire. We bring air in, we breathe air out. Clearly, air must be important for life, because we have another meaning here, right? If you are inspired, you are, enthralled by something, and if you expire, you just died. So clearly, inspire and expire are used in different ways, and air must be kind of important for life. Now, in addition to the inspiration, expiration, we also have conditioning of the air. As you bring air in from the atmosphere, it gets warmed, it gets humidified, and it gets cleansed. So by the time the air reaches down into your microscopic structures of your lung, all the particles have been taken out, right, by the cilia and by the mucus. And you've warmed up that air. And it's pretty important. No matter how cold it is outside, by the time the air gets down to your alveoli, the air will be room temperature, or body temperature, I should say. So no matter, you got about 23 branches of, bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, smaller and smaller branches. And by the time the air gets down to the bottom, the temperature of the air, regardless if it's negative 20 outside, will be at body temperature. You've also got sound production, working with the larynx and the voice box. You've also got olfaction. Your olfactory nerve comes into your nasal passages to help you smell. And you've also got defense, because you've got the mucus made by those goblet cells along the way, and you've got those cilia found in those pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and all of that is catching and trapping particles as it would try to get down into the microscopic structures. So again, I've already shown you the picture of this. The upper respiratory tract is all conducting. It's simply structures bringing air down into your body. You've seen this image. Things to focus here. There are 4 pair of sinuses, but you can only see 2 of them on this picture, only 2 of them also on your lab sagittal section of the head. And that is, you can see the frontal sinus and the sphenoidal sinus. When you bring air up into the nostrils, the flaring nares, the flaring nostrils, the book Amerman called them the nares. There's also the vestibule here, which is the entryway into your nasal passages. Other books might call the opening into the oral cavity the oral vestibule, or the opening into the vagina the vaginal vestibule. When you get up into the nasal passages, we don't think about it, but these concha, these shelf-like structures, are separated by deep tube-like passageways referred to as a meatus. So we know a meatus, like the external auditory meatus, is a tube-like passageway. So the air is coming in, and it's going down these tube-like openings, and as it's coming in, it's getting spun, and it's getting humidified. In the very back of the nasopharynx, there's the adenoids, or the pharyngeal tonsils. The flappy portion is the uvula, the very end of the soft palate. And on each side of the uvula, one can find your, quote, regular tonsils, your palatine tonsils. We know the throat is broken up into 3 parts: the naso, oro, and laryngeal pharynx. The epiglottis is a cartilaginous structure that is going to be like a switch in the tract and make sure that food, as we're swallowing, is diverted only down the esophagus. As you enter into the larynx, there are 2 folds. There's the false vocal cords and the true vocal cords. The true ones are also called, the true ones are the lower ones. The upper, more superior folds are also called the vestibular folds, again, meaning the entryway into the larynx. There are 4 pairs of sinuses, and we can't see them on our head model, but we can see them here in this cartoon. So you can see the additional maxillary sinus and the ethmoidal sinuses. And these names are exactly as the bones, aren't they? So the frontal bone, the ethmoid, the maxilla, and the sphenoid bone. They're all connected by ducts, so should you get an infection in one, it can certainly crawl to another part. Again, the exam is going to be all structures when it comes to the respiratory system. So we already know the pharynx is divided up into those 3 parts. The nasopharynx, think everything above the uvula. The oropharynx, straight back behind the oral cavity, and pretty much where the epiglottis starts and swings, that would be the end of the oropharynx and the beginning of the laryngopharynx. Let's go back. What kind of epithelium would we find? Let's do a little histology review, because we did talk about this in lab a little bit. So within the nasal passages and lining your sinuses, what kind of epithelium? Pseudostratified columnar with cilia. It's the same, right? All of your respiratory passages, including your nasal passages, including the sinuses, have lining them pseudostratified ciliated with columnar. It's essentially a simple epithelium, isn't it? Again, that's why it's so easy in the dry winter months to pick your nose and to bleed, because there's not a stratified layer there to protect you. In the oral cavity, what is there? In the oral cavity, lining the tongue, lining the oral cavity, we know this: stratified, squamous, non-keratinized, right? Alive and well and moist at the surface. Now, what do you think happens? In the back of the throat is also what? The esophagus. All this would also be going down the esophagus. That would also be stratified squamous, wouldn't it? But then as you leave your nasopharynx and you go back into the larynx and down the trachea, what's down there? back to pseudostratified. Okay, so what we have is wherever air is only found, pseudostratified. Where food is also found, stratified. Okay, and that makes sense, doesn't it? So the stratified, as you're eating, you're sloughing off layers of cells. So just think about it. Wherever food would normally be found, oral cavity down the esophagus, that's going to be stratified squamous non-keratinized. Wherever you would normally only have air, nasal passages and larynx, and down into the trachea, that's going to be pseudostratified columnar.
Do goblet cells then produce our nose mucus?
They do. There's goblet cells also lining your nasal passages. Yep, they're creating the mucus layer that still catches particulates when they come in, and those goblet cells can overproduce and give you the gunk that we deal with when we're having a cold as well. Again, I'm going to focus on pictures, structures. You can read about these, and I think you'll benefit from reading through this, but what I'm going to focus on will be structures. As we go down into the lower respiratory tract, we get to the larynx, and we've seen this. This is like our larynx on a stick model. So what's important here? Actually, this is going to help you a lot too in your quiz next week, because next week's quiz is respiratory and urinary structure. So this should also help you solidify for next week. So on the larynx on a stick model, you could see the epiglottis sticking up out of the top. The bone here was the floating bone, the hyoid. Other structures of interest, the biggest chunk of cartilage is the thyroid cartilage. And then the second largest piece of cartilage down here is the cricoid cartilage. Other than that, what you have is what's called tracheal cartilage, or the C rings. And that's the cartilage that literally is in the shape of a C that comes around and keeps your trachea open. We saw that really cool video, I think it's cool, of the quartet singing. And in that, if you look back at it, again, just search for vocal cord quartet if you wanted to review that again. But what you saw when you're looking at that, that laryngoscope is you were seeing the vocal ligaments, which are covered by a membrane called the vocal cords, or the vocal folds. And the true vocal cords are the ones that are producing the sound. They were the ones that were opening and closing. When they were breathing, they were open. When they were singing, they were touching each other like two guitar chords vibrating. There are also the false vocal cords, which are also referred to as the vestibular ligaments, or the vestibular cords, because they have nothing to do with sound, but again, they mark the entryway into the larynx. Don't worry about the corniculate cartilages. They weren't on our list in lab. So again, only focus. If I have extra words here and there, I ignore those things. Think about what we did only in the lab lists. So you can cross off the corniculate cartilages at the bottom. As you're looking at this, if we were to strip away all the mucous membranes and everything else, what you would see looking down would be the vocal cords. Those are the true vocal cords. And when they were singing, you saw them open, or when they were breathing, you saw them open. And then when they were singing, you saw them come closed and vibrate. The big chunk of cartilage on the outside of this view is the thyroid cartilage. The inner is the cricoid cartilage. This is what you saw, right? You saw something that looked sort of like this. Here's the base of the tongue up here at the top. This would be the epiglottis. So actually, if I could turn this thing upside down, I think that's what you saw. You saw it coming down over the tongue, and you saw the epiglottis. So imagine this thing being upside down as you look at this. And then what you saw was them breathing, opening up like this, and then when they brought those cords in close proximity and the air was vibrating, you had sound being produced. If there's any kind of nodules or buildup of scar tissue along here, it can interfere with voice. It can make one hoarse or give them some difficulty. People can have thickened cords, so people who smoke their cords get thicker, and that thickening of the cords makes their voice become deeper, right? When mama's saying bass, kind of thing. That's all I'm going to say right now. I've heard people say, what's the glottis, right? I've heard people say, what's the epiglottis? The epiglottis, we've seen that structure that sticks up. The glottis is really just the area between your vocal cords. So it's fair enough to think of it that way. So the space between your vocal cords themselves would be the glottis, and the epiglottis on the glottis, right? That thing we see sticking up. The trachea, we know it as the windpipe. It's going to travel down through the mediastinum. Along the way, there are going to be somewhere, depending upon how tall you are, 15 to 20 or so C-shaped pieces of cartilage, and that is hyaline cartilage. That's the regular old, common, glassy appearing hyaline cartilage. So if we look down or look at the model of the trachea, so here's the larynx, right? The larynx is protected by the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. So someone says, what's the larynx? It's that bulged area of the top of the trachea, and the larynx, the voice box, is protected by those two big chunks of cartilage. The rest of it is just the trachea, coming down, protected by the C-rings. Where the trachea splits, we have a special name for that, the carina. And that's where it's going to split into the left and right primary bronchus. Now there's a primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and on it goes. But our models really only show primary and secondary. Beyond that, they get too hard to keep track of, in my opinion. So I'd only ask you to make sure you can identify primary and secondary bronchi. Now, again, the first branch is the primary. And the video made a good point of mentioning that because the heart is sitting right here, right? The heart's sitting here, and the lungs have a notch in them called the cardiac notch to make room for the heart. So there's an asymmetry to your lungs. The right lung actually is larger. There's more air going to it. It's composed of 3 lobes, and so the right primary bronchus is larger in diameter. It's going to carry more air. There's more lung tissue to do the gas exchange. It also is more vertical, so it's more of a straight downward shot. On the left-hand side, to make room for the heart, the left primary bronchus makes more of a horizontal turn. And it's smaller because there is less lung tissue on the left side. So if you're going to have something come down like a penny, right, if you're going to swallow something wrong or aspirate food down, it's more than likely going to drop down the right side. Then the secondary bronchi are the branches off from it. And there are as many secondary bronchi as there are lobes. So on the left-hand side, there are only 2 lobes. On the right-hand side, there are 3 lobes. And so there's only going to be 2 or 3 secondary bronchi, respectively. If you take a quick look at the histology of the trachea, you would find a large lumen, the L, big air space. And we can't see it at this magnification, but it tells us that the lumen would be lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and that in this staining, the hyaline cartilage appears as a yellow. So you see that C-ring of cartilage. So if you see a big open air space, a blank space, with cartilage right next to it, you know you must be in the trachea, right? That's going to be a nice little clue. So if on the lab exam, you're seeing a tissue under the microscope and it shows a big open space with some cartilage next to it, and you recognize cartilage. Remember, it looks like those little eyeballs looking back at you. If you were to see that, you know it's trachea. And then you would also know that the epithelium lining that must be pseudostratified columnar. The bronchial tree continues to branch progressively into smaller and smaller things. Now what happens, though, is that the trachea is kept open by C-rings, isn't it? The trachea does not collapse. It is kept open by those C-rings. But as you go further and further down the branches of the bronchial tree, there'll be less and less cartilage and more muscle. And the kind of muscle you will find will be smooth muscle. A person who has asthma knows this. They know that the airways can start to close down. And what's closing down are the smooth muscles. that are closing down the airways. So the trachea will never close down, right? The trachea can't close down because it's got the C-rings keeping it wide open. In fact, if someone's having anaphylactic shock, what do? Right? They've eaten peanuts, they got stung by a bee. What happens? Their tongue can swell up and their airway can get blocked. So what do? Take a Beck pen, right, and stick it in here, right, and open up that airway, right, and open up the trachea to restore the airflow to the lungs. But if the airways down here are also plugged down in the bronchioles, that'll only be somewhat effective, right? So if all those little bronchioles are squeezing down as well. So again, as you move down the bronchial tree, you have less and less cartilage and more muscle, smooth muscle around those bronchioles. Just read through this. I think you'll find this to be very easy to digest. Coming down again, carina where it splits, primary and secondary bronchi going to the different lobes. The left lobe, the left lung only has two lobes, superior and inferior. The right lobe, or the right lung, is going to have superior, middle, and inferior lobes. In the left side, there's going to be this notched out area. Again, that's the cardiac notch, making room for the heart. Now, what happens when we get all the way down to the microscopic structures? Now, think about this. This is the pulmonary side. So you know that the red and blue, and everything's reversed on us color-wise. So blood is going to be coming down into your lungs, and this is going to be coming in on pulmonary arteries and pulmonary arterioles, right? Blood's coming in, blue blood's coming into the lung. And then each and every one of these little air sacs has its own cute little capillary bed. Aren't those cute? Right, so every little alveolus has its own dedicated little capillary bed surrounding it. And as that blue blood comes in, what happens? Air is being brought into the lung. That air is being exchanged, that oxygen is being exchanged into the blood, and the blood's now going to leave through a series of pulmonary veins that are leaving red and oxygenated. The air came down through the bronchioles. So the bronchioles are bringing air down into these air sacs. Under the microscope, there was a slide of this in the lab. What you would see when looking at lung tissue, you would see all of these spaces, right? All of these little alveoli. So you are looking at the little delicate layers of the lung. And again, what kind of epithelium would this be? Simple squamous, right? Simple squamous making up these little alveolar sacs.
Where does it stop with the pseudostratified?
Pseudostratified is going to stop as we come down the trachea and then down into the bronchioles. Those will still have pseudostratified, and it becomes, it's still going to be mucosal membrane all the way through. And then when we get to the alveoli, then those little air sacs will be simple squamous. About 300 to 400 million of these little air sacs. And then if you just look at the lungs, just open up your chest and look at your lungs, what you would see would be, this is no surprise, the base of the lung, and this muscle would be what right here? There's your diaphragm, right? So the diaphragm, lungs are sitting on it. We call this the base of the lungs. That's sitting on the diaphragm, whereas the top of the lungs would be the apex. Think about the heart. The apex was the pointy portion. The base was the top, kind of backwards, if you will. But the base was where the aorta and the pulmonary trunk were emerging. Remember, the lungs are surrounded by the pleura. And honestly, I think the rest of this gets me into things that I'm not going to quiz you on because it's not structure. Let me just check and see what else there might be here. There is, I will say this, because we've been talking about the lymphatic system a little bit, there is a tremendous number of lymph nodes and lymphatic activity associated with the lung. And this is why if a person has a lung cancer, that cancer oftentimes will metastasize to other places. We know that lung cancers oftentimes go to the brain or to bone, and they travel because there's so much lymphatic activity here. So cancers from the lung will travel elsewhere, but it's also true that cancers from someplace else will sometimes metastasize to the lung. So again, because of all this lymphatic activity, this is a conduit for those cancer cells to travel. So the lung, unfortunately, becomes sort of a crossroads for much of the lymphatic activity. I'm not going to quiz you at all on the physiology of breathing, so the muscles and all this are not going to be part of our conversation. I think all I need to share with you in the last minute is just going to the very, very last slide, just so again we're thinking about what happens to the respiratory system as we age. I think this is just a very fair thing to think about. And as we get older, like all of our systems, the respiratory system will become less efficient. There will be less elasticity, less ability of the lungs to stretch and to take in air. And that's going to decrease our ability to get air into our lungs. If you're a smoker or have been around a lot of black dust type things, you might develop something like emphysema where the alveoli become destroyed. And I want you to think about this last thing. If you're not getting good gas exchange and you're not able to blow the air out very good, what would be accumulating in your body? This is going to bring us back to where we were just a moment ago with the CO2 stories. But if your respiratory system's not doing well and you're not blowing off CO2, remember your cells are always making CO2. It's a waste product of respiration. And so if you're constantly making CO2, but your lungs are not doing a good job of pumping it out, then what's accumulating in your blood? CO2. And now your blood is becoming more acidic. And as it becomes more acidic, what will your body want to do? Speed up your respiration rate and speed up your heart rate. So people with emphysema, people with lung conditions, actually, because their body is sensing it's becoming more acidic, their respiration rate will go up. And they'll start getting faster but shallower breathing. Right? They'll start breathing faster but not as deeply. And that's one of the signs of emphysema, a person who's breathing really, really fast. And again, what's going to accumulate in our lungs will be the dust and the particles and the pollution of life, but those can also get into and accumulate in our lymph nodes, and that can set up, again, metastasis of our cancer. So that's 27 minutes, really quick. That's all I'm going to quiz you on the respiratory system. And that, again, that's on the final exam. And it's just going to be structures. So that'll leave us just now with urinary and reproductive to deal with after exam number 5.